Hello and welcome to MOTH News Live for a special broadcast. This evening we're discussing the tragic school shooting at a school in Sweden, which has left 10 people dead, including the suspected gunman. The attack described by the Prime Minister in the area has said it's the worst mass shooting in Swedish history and has shocked the nation. Police are still investigating the suspect's motive, ruling out ideological reasons. Several people remain injured and authorities are working to provide more details to help us understand the situation better. We have Philip O'Connor. Thanks for joining us, Philip. I'd say you're wrecked because I know you're at the scene. You've been at it for a couple of days. You've been following the story very closely, obviously. So, look, tell us what do we know so far?
Yeah, I mean, I've worked on some big stories and some big cases in my time, Keith, but this has to be up there with the absolute worst things I've ever seen. It was about just gone 12:30 yesterday when the police first got notice that gunshots had been heard at the Risbergska Skolan, which is it's not exactly in downtown Örebro, it's a little bit outside, but this is a small town. So I think plenty of Irish people and plenty of viewers around the world will know the kind of vibe. It's 10 minutes drive from where I'm sitting now in the centre of Örebro. So the police were warned that this was happening, and at the same time, a fire alarm in the school went off. So there was all sorts of rumors of, fire bombs and hand grenades and all sorts of stuff going on. So basically, the police made their way there as quickly as possible. They have patrols going out around the place, and they realized very, very quickly that this was going to be a very, very big incident indeed. I was at a police press conference this morning, and I spoke to two of the chiefs of police here, and they told me that when they arrived at the school, they were actually shot at by the gunman. No, they didn't kill him. They told me that they didn't kill him. When they found him, he had already administered a gunshot wound to himself. At least that's their hypothesis. They're 99% sure that he shot himself, and that was the end of it. Now, just to give you a little bit of background, Keith, the school that he was at, it's not a sort of, a Sandy Hook situation. It's not somebody going into a school for very young children or for teenagers and that kind of thing, right? It's an adult education facility. Over here, they're called Komvux. Kom is kommun, which is like the local council, and Vux is Vuxen. So that means adult, right? So it's the kind of place that you go for two reasons, really, or three reasons, let's say, right? One is if you don't get your high school diploma, right? So if you don't actually graduate from high school here, you go there and you do your maths and you do your Swedish and you do your science, and then, you might get it. You might get it when you're 25 or 30 or that kind of thing, but that's how you do it. So if, like you and me, you didn't spend too much time in secondary school, that's where you go to complement your education. Now, another reason for going there is if you're learning Swedish. So they have something here called SFE, which is Swedish for immigrants, is basically how it translates. And we often joke that it should be called Swedish for Irish people because we all end up going there to learn the language when we move here. So that's the kind of school that this man walked into just after 12 o'clock yesterday and started shooting. Now, today in the media, he has been named, right? So, we always love to tell you on Moth News, the reason you watch Moth News and listen to broadcasts like this, we tell you how the sausage is made, right? I was outside this fella's house last night. We kind of knew, we'd been talking to people. Sometimes people can't confirm things officially and that, but they sort of put you on the right path. They'll give you a hint. And I was actually outside his apartment building filming last night because we knew pretty much who it was that had done it. Today in the media, he's been named. I'm not sure if the police have confirmed it yet. As we were going on air, I don't think they have. But in media, in two of the biggest newspapers here, he's been named as Rickard Andersson. He was a 35-year-old man who lived in central Örebro here. People who knew him and his family and that have spoken of him as being very much a social loner, of not having friends. We know, because this is one of those societies where an awful lot of information is public. What I pay in tax is public on the internet for everybody to see. So we know that Rickard didn't graduate from high school. In fact, he failed most of his subjects in it. So at 35, he was actually in this school up until 2021, studying mathematics and that kind of thing to try to get up to a high school diploma. Rickard, we also know that he held a hunting license. He had a license to have 4 firearms at home. And that's going to surprise some people listening to this, Keith, because people think of Sweden as this, social democratic paradise, as the antithesis, if you like, of, North America or the United States of America, where you can buy guns at a supermarket. Guns are actually quite common here in Sweden and in Norway. Hunting is a big part of the cultural life here. This is a rural town, and hunting is a big part of that. So we know that Rickard had a license for 4 different guns at home. We know that in order to have that license, you have to have a license to hunt, right? And that all comes down to firearm safety and how to handle them and load them and unload them and deal with your catch and all that kind of thing. So that's what we know about him at the moment. But as you mentioned in the introduction, and this was weird, and the police rolled back on it a little bit earlier on today, Keith. Last night they said it's not terrorism and it's not ideological. And pretty much everybody in the country went, how can you tell? Right? How have you, have you gone through his phone? Have you gone through his computer? Have you gone through his social media profile? Have you gone through all these things and found out? And if you haven't and you're just guessing, that's fine too. But it's actually impossible to say something like that close to the incident and say that it wasn't ideological. The fact that some of the people who were killed there were in the Swedish for immigrant classes and that they would have been of a foreign background might suggest that there would have been an ideological reason. And I'm not saying that there was, but what I'm saying is, if I was the police, I wouldn't have been telling people that this wasn't terrorism. I wouldn't have been telling people that this wasn't ideological, because I will tell you for a fact, Keith, that there are people out there who are in terror. That's where I've come from now. I've just been across the road from the school between about 4:30 and about 6:30 local time here, and it was broadcasting live. And if you had your television on at that time, I guarantee you will have seen the pictures that I was broadcasting, because it was just candles and flowers and candles and flowers, and people standing there crying because this has come into their lives in this sleepy little rural town. Now all of a sudden they are up there with Dunblane, they are up there with Sandy Hook, they are up there with Utøya in Norway. It's finally come to this town of Örebro where I'm sitting tonight.
So the terrorism ideological, reason for the attack, it's very strange, because as you said, people have been terrorized. But what we now know terrorism means is if, somebody, with a different skin color maybe, or from another country, or has a reason to hate the country and is trying to exact some revenge. And then the ideological side of it is, somebody maybe local who doesn't like the immigrants that have moved into the area. So they're the two camps. But ultimately, it doesn't really matter. I presume, first of all, that the local police are saying that to quell any kind of reaction from, you do have people in Sweden who, I don't know, would you call them Nazi? Would you call them right wing? Like they're skinheads? I know that there is that. There is a grouping of people in Sweden, and it's there. It's underground, but it's there. So, I mean, that's, I presume, the police trying to stop anybody having a reaction to what happened. Or I'm sure you can tell me about social media and what was going out in social media about what happened, all the guessing and the presuming and the stirring up of the pot of ignorance and violence. So, I mean, that's kind of like, it's interesting that, like, we have to say these people are terrorized by what happened. To say it wasn't terrorism in inverted commas, but people were terrorized.
Yeah.
And has there been reaction from the different sides, from left wing, right wing?
In all the years I've worked with journalism, and that's a long time now, terrorism and terror is one of those words that I've avoided because it's so subjective, right? Because terror is not, I mean, the people that I spoke to and people that I saw crying as they lit their candles with their children, putting them out there tonight, and they were from everywhere. There was Kurds, there was Eritreans, there was people from Somalia, there was Swedish people, in inverted commas, because some would be born here and may not look like they were born here. These people were terrorized, right? But in the political sense of the word, in the medial sense of the word, that's one of those things that people like to avoid, right? Because to suggest that one way or another, it's the same thing if it had been somebody who goes to a mosque on a Friday rather than a church on a Sunday, or maybe doesn't go to church at all. But that does sow the seeds of terror in people, And it's very unsurprising that it would happen, because this is such a normal thing. People go to school every day. My wife's a school teacher. My kids, one of them is in university, the other's in school. It's something that touches virtually every adult in the country knows somebody who's in school, either their own children or somebody else's. And the hard part, there was actually an Irishman saying to me on Blue Sky last night that it hit extra hard because of the fact that this Swedish for Immigrants class was on in the same building, because that's what he's doing at the moment. He's only recently arrived in Sweden. And if you think to yourself, well, that could have been me, or that could have been the class that I was sitting in, So the very hard part, the police have really sort of struggled, and they came out today and they talked about these things of, the erroneous narratives that were being floated online. And there's literally, I mean, I sort of searched when I got back to the hotel last night. And it's one of those things, like, if you don't want to know, don't do that search. Don't go to Twitter and put in that word, the name of this town, because the nonsense that's out there, and so much of it is wrong. And again, if we don't want to talk about how the sausage is made, when I'm in the eye of the hurricane here, I don't actually see everything, because I might be at a press conference with the police when the Prime Minister is holding another press conference. I was there today when the King arrived to the church, and I was speaking to the Prime Minister afterwards, and the Justice Minister was over there. So the Justice Minister may have said something and I didn't hear it because I'm busy doing what I'm doing. But the information that was flying around was absolutely uncanny, and the amount of wrong names. And it's getting up there that, you know, it used to be Instagram and TikTok and that kind of thing that used to be bad. And then it was Twitter. And now it's WhatsApp. And the WhatsApps are flying around the place. And it's, you know, immediately, because I'd seen the school, I know what the school looked like. I've been looking at it most of the day yesterday. And people would send me a video. And they'd say, "Oh, here's a video to shoot." It's not even a school in Sweden, you know. You can tell from the writing on the sides, that kind of thing. It's like people just start sending these things around because people get sort of, you know, caught up in everything else like that, because it's a very, very emotive thing. And like that, it's a blank canvas. So it's very easy for you to project that, oh, this was an Islamist or this was a Nazi. And when I say you, I mean, Leila, it's very easy for all of us to do that kind of thing, because we all draw our own conclusions. And it's so hard not to do that. But one of the things that, when the police came out and said that there was a lot of erroneous narratives around, I'd have to say some of it has to do with the vacuum that they are leaving, right? Because they're not providing information. Again, there's something we talk about in this channel the whole time. So when I was on the way here yesterday, the first information we had was that 5 people were injured, right? And again, you know, I'm the old dog for the hard road when it comes to these things. If you're talking to me about injuries first, I want to know about the dead, right? Tell me about the dead, because what they're doing is they're sort of waiting and they're waiting and they're waiting, and they don't want to start this drip, 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 drip. And what they did was, at 6 o'clock at a press conference yesterday evening, they hit us with 10 dead, right? The same thing happened with Anders Behring Breivik in Utøya back in 2011, I think it was, when his bomb attack and his gun attack killed 77 people. 69.
That was the island in Norway.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. But overnight, that went from being, you know, 12, 16 people dead. And I remember sleeping for a couple of hours, and all of a sudden it was up over 70, you know. And when that vacuum occurs, and when the police are coming out now, all day they've been saying, "Oh, we can't tell you that. We can't tell you if you had more than one weapon. We can't tell you if it was an automatic weapon. We can't tell you if it was a hunting weapon, if it was a handheld weapon, if it was a long gun. We can't tell you any of that." Why not? Okay, because you've told us that you believe that the main suspect is dead. Tell us what you know, okay? Now, I fully understand that this is one of the biggest criminal investigations that will ever happen in this country, maybe second only to the investigation into the murder of Prime Minister Olof Palme in the 1980s, right? This is going to be huge. And establishing, because this is owed to both the victims and to the town and to the people of Sweden, the citizens of Sweden, establishing the timeline and establishing the motive for this is vitally important to Swedish society, right? But that won't be changed by saying, we believe that he had more than one weapon. We believe that the weapon was of this type, of this caliber, right? Give people something that they can discuss, right? Because at least then, if you're going off Googling something, you can Google how many rounds a Glock holds. You can Google how, you know, if you can buy an AK-47 over the counter here in Sweden, which you can't, you know, but that will keep you busy, right? Because that vacuum on social media and in social interaction, gossip didn't arrive with Facebook, Keith. Gossip didn't arrive with Twitter or Instagram. This has happened as long as human beings have been able to communicate and make fires. We've sat around those fires telling stories. And oftentimes, and as Irish people, we know this very well, there'll be a little bit of exaggeration in it. But I honestly don't think that society is well served by politicians or the police not telling us what they know in good time. And indeed, I have to say, it's a credit to the journalists who are working here today, an awful lot of them from Sweden, from Denmark, from Norway, and they pressed the police on this and said, you are going to have to tell us these things, and we will keep asking you. And I think that's a very, very healthy sign that the police were kind of going, yeah, we're in trouble here. You know, our feet are being held to the fire here, and they didn't like it. Now, they didn't change anything, but they are certainly looking at that then and trying to do more in terms of the information that they release to the general public.
We may have. Oh, you're back. I think momentarily. Yep. You were saying they didn't change anything, and then we lost you.
Yeah. I was saying that, the journalists here in Sweden and Denmark and Norway have been very good at holding their feet to the fire. There's a whole there was a room full of police this morning. And the way, I mean, people have been in media for a long time know that when a press event is being held, sometimes the goal of that press event is to get out of there without saying anything at all, right? And there was very few calories in the police press conference this morning until the one-to-one interviews started to happen, and you go eyeball to eyeball and you start to put people on the spot and saying, okay, what can you tell me and why can't you tell me other things? Because as I say, we will fill that vacuum. As human beings, we are curious. We want to know. We want to understand. And part of that is to do with restoring the sense of safety, right? So in the post 9/11 world, we all wanted to know that it was going to be safe to fly again. In the post-COVID world, we all wanted to know that it would be safe to travel again. It would be safe to sit around a table again and to have a few pints again, And that's part of the rebuilding of public trust, is you get that information, then you can think about it, So one of the things that was being asked the police, for instance, was, had they any reason to be self-critical? Did they react quickly enough? Because I think there was a case in Texas recently of a school shooting. I can't remember the name of the school now in particular. I hope the viewers and listeners will forgive me. But the police basically stood around doing nothing for a long time, and it came out a few days later. So here they were very quick to say, okay, what did you do and how fast did you do it? Did you get the reinforcements you needed quick enough? When you were fired upon, what did you do? Did you retreat? And this kind of thing. Now, a lot of that's operational details I won't go to go into. They will have to answer those questions in time. Usually what will happen in Scandinavia is a public inquiry will be set up into this, and they will answer those questions in time. But what was good was seeing good, honest to God, hardworking journalists out there today asking those questions, because they're the answers we need to rebuild the trust in one another after something like this has happened.
I don't want to seem sensationalist, but you don't expect this to happen in Sweden. Yep. I mean, we didn't expect what happened in Norway all those years ago, an absolute devastating tragedy. But I'm sure this is at this community college for adults, I suppose. They're young people as far as I'm concerned. You're talking about 20-year-olds plus. These people, there wouldn't have been security. They wouldn't have expected something like this to happen. I mean, is this something that we need to be looking at in Ireland? The most unlikely place you'd imagine something like this would happen, but...
The interesting thing about this country, Keith, is that it is so open, right? And going to, the boundaries of your house, the way if we owned a house in Ireland or in England or wherever else, in a city somewhere, you build walls around it and you put up big fences and people don't see in and that kind of thing, right? Where I live, there's literally pathways between the houses. There's like two houses, and there's pathways between them. And if somebody took a shortcut out to their car in the road and that kind of thing, you wouldn't look crossways at them. I've often taken... a shortcut across a local school's playground, and sometimes you might even do it while school is in session. That's how open these things are, right? There's nothing that's, like anything that you would have around a daycare centre, for instance, wouldn't be more than maybe 1.5 meters high, because the idea is to keep the kids in, not to keep adults out, because until now there has been no reason to do so. Now, the other thing that we have to be wary of is a knee-jerk reaction, right? Because as you mentioned quite rightly, I think it's actually up to 11 people dead now. It is the worst mass shooting in history in Sweden. The previous record was 7 in a place called Fallen, which is a good bit north of here. So we are up to that. But you can't legislate or you can't change the law based on 1 or 2 incidents like this. What Anders Behring Breivik did in Norway was absolutely extraordinary. And I remember being on Marianne Finucane's program on Radio 1 back in the day, and I said to her that everything has changed in Norway. Or no, I said to her, oh, it's all changed in Norway now. And she said, what's changed? I said, Marianne, everything has changed now. When something that seismic happens, when that level of mass murder happens in the society, you cannot but be changed by it, And what's happening here this evening outside that school, where people are gathering and they're laying flowers and they're lighting candles, there's an area here called Vivala, and Vivala is kind of the tougher area. It might be the more underprivileged area around here. The mosque is open, the youth club is open. Adults are there looking to talk to young people about this and reassure them that this isn't every day in Sweden, and it should be no day at all, but it was yesterday. And from now on, everything will be changed. We'll always have this stain. We will always have, the broadcasts that we've seen, the people that we've spoken to, the memorial service that was on today in the big church here in Örebro. We have to deal with this now in some way. The way of dealing with that is not, as Jens Stoltenberg, who was the Prime Minister of Norway back when Anders Behring Breivik carried out his attack, he said that it was more openness and more love that was needed from society rather than the opposite, right? Because when you talk about this guy, Rickard Andersson, who has been named as the perpetrator who took his own life at the scene, His problems appear to be very much psychiatric. He appears to have had very few friends, if any at all. He couldn't get a job, and apparently he had been cut off his social welfare because he wasn't even trying to get a job. But this is clearly a man who had serious, serious problems. And I'm not excusing what he did, or I'm not saying, you'll often find in the headlines that, if it was an Islamist, it might be ideologically or politically motivated. Whereas if it's a white person doing these things, it's always the lone nutter, the lone gunman. I don't think anybody in their right mind goes out and does something like this. I think everybody has some sort of psychosis or some sort of psychiatric issue. How can you kill people in cold blood without that, Yeah. But the question that I would be asking is, how did a man spend virtually his entire life, and literally everybody that has been spoken to, from his family to his friends to his neighbors, and remember, I was outside his place last night, right? They all say the same thing, that he was such a loner. He was so cut off from society. And my question is, why wasn't society doing more to help him? He obviously had a motive for doing this, right? We've floated several possibilities here, but we need to find out what those things were, where all of these things, exactly as you mentioned, all these things are a failure of society, either a failure of security or a failure 10, 15, 20 years ago to support people in the way that they need. And that's going to be the hard part, is keeping heads cool. And instead of just banning guns outright, or, building, 3-meter walls around every school in the country and metal detectors and all that kind of thing, it's keep a cool head and work out what the smart thing to do is here to make sure that this never happens again.
The problem is, Philip, and I'm bringing it back to Ireland, I know, this is sort of taking it away from the terrible tragedy that you're witnessing right now and working on right now. The problem is that we've witnessed in the last year, especially, more and more cuts to people who have been through the care system. Say, for instance, I'm just using this as an example, and are coming out the other side and are literally homeless, familyless, institutionless, otherless, and rudderless, and I just think that this is exactly what we are doing. This is, you talk about the police, not, you don't want the police to leave a vacuum for tittle tattle. We're creating a vacuum for a situation like this to happen. And I would love, and I don't want to, as I said, sensationalize, but I would love for the Irish government to look at this and go, we need to roll back on those cuts, and we need to go towards these people with more money, more facilities, more love, and an arm around the shoulder. Because if we don't, I'm not saying it will, but these things do happen, unfortunately, and they don't happen for no reason.
No,
it is a failure of society.
This is the thing, and I mentioned the other big sort of criminal case in the history of this country was the death of Olof Palme, who was murdered on a Stockholm street in February in the mid-80s on his way back from the cinema one night. And Palme's vision, like Tage Erlander, who was a prime minister before him, they had this vision of a Swedish people's home. They call it Folkhemmet in Swedish, the people's home. And what underpinned that, Keith, was a social safety net through which no one could fall, right? So it didn't matter how bad things got in terms of your mental health, your physical health, your employment status, anything else like that, you would still be able to live a good, decent, dignified life. Now, there are always going to be people who fall outside that, right? There are always going to be people who either can't or don't want to be helped, right? But they are a tiny minority, right? Most people want to work. They want to be healthy enough to work. They want to be secure. They want to have dignity in their work. They want to be able to have a family and have friends and have hobbies and that kind of thing, and indulge in all those things without a break in the bank. But we are now moving more and more towards societies that don't value those things at all. What they value is paying less tax, because let's face it, if you're going to do these things as a society, right, if you're not going to leave it to the Rickard Andersons of this world to take care of his own mental health, and you're saying that the state or society has to do it, there is a cost attached to that, right? But oftentimes it's presented to you as, okay, Keith Walsh, if I give you a sort of a 2% cut in your tax rate, you go, oh yeah, that's grand, I'll vote for that. But the cost of that is not paid by you. The cost of that is paid by the services that are cut to people who need it. And that's one of the things that was transcendental for me living in Sweden, Keith, was realizing that actually I'm happy enough to pay the taxes I pay here, right? A, they're not a whole lot more than what they would have been in Ireland, but B, I see the good that money has done and that it does and that it could do again, right? Because the school system here has gone downhill now since they started reducing taxes. We've had a centre-right government going on for the last while again, and they're still doing the same things. And I see instantaneously when they cut back on things like youth clubs, right? Any kid that I can meet in sport or that I can meet in a youth club or that kind of thing, if they have that sort of contact surface with me, right, they're going to be okay. But if I don't have those places, if I don't have those halls where we can play basketball, and we can play football, and we can do jiu-jitsu and that kind of thing, I don't come into contact with them, you know. And that, you know, having adults, and I'm not saying me personally, I'm saying having adults around these young people is very, very important to keep them on the straight and narrow, help them get jobs, help them understand their relationships, help them understand their schooling, what they need to get by. If they need to go to a place like this school that was shut up to complement their grades, to get a proper job so they can go get married and do all the things they want to do. But like I said, those things cost money. And that's really the crux of where we are right now. I think that that's what this investigation will likely show, is that in some way the state certainly failed. And again, I'm not taking personal responsibility for this man at all, no matter what his psychiatric status was, right? But you know, there's enough responsibility to go round that we all have to look at ourselves as what could we have done better here? Could I have done better on these things as a journalist, as a father, as a citizen in Stockholm? Could I have spent, you know, one more night out wandering around the streets, talking to young fellas and young ones and seeing what they're up to, trying to encourage them to get into boxing or that kind of thing, you know? But ultimately it comes down to putting those resources in there. And that political will, yes, it comes from the political parties, but they do what we put them in there to do. And if enough people come back and say, we want this stopped, we want mental health services, because we saw it with the water charges in Ireland, much as we saw with the poll tax in England during the 80s. If there's mass mobilization of people around specific things, politicians will fold like a cheap tent.
Philip, I'll leave you go because I know you're busy, you're tired, and thank you very much for joining me. Hopefully we'll see you on MOTH News Live on Friday at 3 p.m. as usual. And if not, I'm sure you're doing better things for the people of Sweden. But thanks, Philip.
I wouldn't miss it for the world. Talk to you Friday.
Good man. See you then. Good luck.
Thank
you, everybody. That was Philip live from. I'm going to say you're going to correct me, aren't you? Örebro.
Good man yourself.
Örebro. Okay, so because people will be wondering how to pronounce that. So Örebro in Sweden, and we will see you on Friday. Surely we'll have more on this, and we will be discussing it again. Have a good evening. Mind yourself and mind.